I'm Ben Haddad, and I'm the Senior Director for the Europe Center here at the Atlantic Council. I'm really delighted to be introducing this conversation organized by Eurasia Center with Bernard-Henri Lévy, the French philosopher, activist, intellectual, with Melinda Herring, Deputy Director of our Eurasia Center, on the unfolding situation in Ukraine. This conversation is obviously very timely as we see Russian aggression and threats rekindling against Ukraine, and we need to build a transatlantic front and unity to support the sovereignty and freedom of the Ukrainian people. I first met Bernard-Henri Lévy actually in Ukraine in 2014 on Maidan as the people of Kyiv was rising against its dictator for freedom and for a closer relationship with the European Union. At the time, we had the intuition that the future of Europe was not being played in the offices of Brussels, but rather on the streets of Maidan, where thousands of young men and women were being targeted, were being shot at because they just dared to brandish a European flag for a better future. This was the first time in history that citizens were being shot at for a European flag. Years later, we see once again Ukraine in the news. But one person has not forgotten about Ukraine in all this time. It is Bernard-Henri Lévy, who has gone back to Ukraine several times, who has been a leading voice for Ukraine in Europe and around the globe. Today, we will be showing you a trailer for his new movie documentary, The Will to See, where he traveled to several places, including to Ukraine at a time where so many of us in the United States, in Europe, had forgotten about this war on the European continent. So I'm really delighted to be opening this conversation. Bernard, thank you so much for joining us. You're here in person in Washington, D.C., once again to be a voice for these causes that have been forgotten by so many. I also want to really salute the terrific work that our Eurasia Center has been doing on this situation for the last months, and of course, with Ambassador John Herbst and Melinda Herring. Thank you so much for joining us for this conversation, and let me turn it to you, Melinda.
Good morning, Ben. Thank you so much for that warm introduction. It's my great pleasure to bring a special event to you today from Washington, D.C. Bernard has just arrived from Paris, and he has a brilliant new book and film. His book is called The Will to See. And while the rest of us spent our COVID year feeling sorry for ourselves, Bernard went to 8 different international hotspots and made a wonderful film. Unfortunately, we can't show the full film today, so we're going to show you a sneak preview right now. Here we are.
What is the biggest enemy, ISIS or Erdogan?
Pendant que l'Occident se confine dans la peur d'un virus inconnu, aucun couvre-feu sur le front des guerres oubliées.
Fight for your freedom, you fight also for our freedom.
Juifs, musulmans, chrétiens, c'est la même chose. On est des frères.
Des guerres dont on n'entend pas parler et qui sont peut-être en train de définir notre avenir et notre destin.
Des guerres silencieuses et autant de peuples ignorés, abandonnés, à qui il faut rendre un visage. Ce voyage ne fait que commencer.
Never turn your back on us.
I will be with the Kurds till the end of my life.
Thank you so much. That's incredibly powerful, and I can't wait to see the full film. Could you show us a few more pictures from your recent trip? So Ukraine was one of the 8 places you went. We'd love to see more of that. Would you narrate that trip for us?
Of course. And it was, for me, a very important segment of the film, yes.
So here you have some photos. Here I am it is at night. I spent a few days in the trench close to the ghost town of Pisky, and we have a moment of rest with some brave officers who were facing the paramilitary, the proxies of Putin at this time.
And this is January 2021, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
This is in the area of Zolote. You have, as you can see, exactly as in Kurdistan, you have some ladies. Here you have close to me a young lady called Marta Sturma, who is a very brave, valiant, and brilliant young lady soldier. And why do I say that? To mean that this army is a patriotic army, citizens in arms, women and men. On the other side, you have proxies, you have mercenaries, you have bandits and Wagner commandos. Here, you have the army of citizens. And you can see the age. Some are very young, some are less young. You know, all generation, they are here to defend their fatherland and values of Europe. Here we are in a trench. A few minutes ago, there was a rocket which were shot a few, maybe 50 meters behind me. So we are on a shelter area of Pisky also. I have some mud on my coat because it was a hot moment. And you see this man, he is the father, I think, Mr. Sturma, of the lady I did show you. Old generation, this one on the right. He may be 50, 60 maybe. That is what Ben Haddad was just evoking before. 2004, it is, I must confess, Melinda, one of the most moving moments of my life as a committed and engaged intellectual. This is Maidan. There is 200,000 or 300,000 or 400,000 people on the Maidan, and I had the great honor, the immense pride to be asked to address the crowd. And for me, it was such a moving moment to see, as Ben said, these Ukrainian people fighting for Europe, risking to die, and a few days before, 2 days before, dying really for Europe, was such a lesson of courage for all of us. And this moment, when I delivered this speech, I did it twice. The speech is available on YouTube, and for me, it was really so moving. It was a treat. This is just after my speech on the Maidan. You see, these ladies, these gentlemen, they have no idea of who I am, I'm sure. They just saw a European intellectual, a French intellectual, telling them, you are the sentinels of Europe, you are waving our flag, you are more courageous sometime than we are. And they were just happy that someone came to tell them that. Here I am in front of President Zelensky. It is 2 or 3 days before his election. It was in between the 2 rounds of the election.
In 2019.
In 2019, yes.
Yeah.
He was not yet president. He was going to be president in a few days after. I was very impressed, to be honest, by this young man who was much more brilliant than I thought. And I was so impressed that a Jew could be elected, because this day we were in a restaurant, we smell, he smell, the smell of victory. So for me, till now, by the way, it's a mystery and a good news for Ukraine, how this country, who has a long tradition of anti-Semitism, who was one of the country of the Holocaust by bullets, how this country could elect a committed positive, asserted Ukrainian Jew, this was in a way a good news. I was in favor of Poroshenko at this time, as I am still today, but a Jew elected president of Ukraine in this country devastated by anti-Semitism, it was, how would I say, it was like Putin at the same time, at the same moment said, Ukraine is fascist,
Exactly.
Anti-Semitism is devastating the country. Come on, there is probably, this day, there was probably less anti-Semites in Ukraine than in France. That's what the election of Zelensky meant.
He blew away that myth, the Russian myth of an anti-Semitic Ukraine.
He blew away completely that myth, not because of himself, because of the voters.
Exactly.
You know, the voters voted these 3 days after this meeting. I was the only one, I think, to meet him, by the way. They voted against anti-Semitism, against the dark part of the Ukrainian memory.
And to make it even more ironic, President Zelensky was elected and the prime minister was also Jewish at the same time. It was the only country outside of Israel that had a president and a prime minister who was Jewish.
I know. And this, I had my sympathy. I did do so many things with Poroshenko before. But I must say that this idea of this country electing a Jew and putting a Jew as prime minister was a denial of this myth.
While we're talking about Zelensky, you wrote some really interesting things about him in your book. You said that he's muddling through pretty well in spite of very difficult circumstances. The Trump debacle, Russian escalation, and he's had a very, I'd say, rough 2 years. You also said that you were struck that he was sardonic and that he has a serene sense of self-assurance. And you wrote something very, I think, profound. You said history could not have chosen a worse, or history could have chosen a worse champion to stand up to Putin and his imperialism to defend the colors and the values of Europe. I thought that was a really brilliant passage. Do you think that President Zelensky, you've met him multiple times, will he be able to meet the moment that we're in now and rally the people in Ukraine and keep Europe together?
I hope so. The day you are mentioning was 2 years after this meeting. It was in his presidential office. I was back from the front line. I was back from the trenches where I spent some time with these patriotic fighters. I told him my impressions, and I felt what I wrote, that he was a good patriot, that he was really aware of the sort of threat represented by Putin, and that he was determined to fight. I hope I was right. We all can be wrong on judgment on people. But this other day, I had this impression that this man who was not apparently shaped for the role, who probably never thought that his destiny was to face one of the worst dictators in the world, this comic actor. Suddenly, I felt that he really endorsed the government, that he really, he played the role, the real role of commander-in-chief of Ukraine. I had this feeling. I hope I'm not wrong. I hope I will be right in the next days.
Let me ask you one other question about Zelensky. Did anything else surprise you about him? You've met him multiple times now.
Not multiple times, a few times. What surprised me, yes, it was, the Ukrainian army, which is now preparing for the assault of the proxies, the Wagner commandos, and the army of Putin. The new Ukrainian army. It was built by Poroshenko, for sure. This is his merit. He deserves this credit in the eye of history. He built the army from nearly nothing. Poroshenko built the army, which means that the grievance which is done to him today is absurd and is unfair. But I must say that when I saw Zelensky, he did not build the army, but he dealt well with this new army. A few days before our encounter, he was on the front line. Mm-hmm. He was in Zolote. He was close to Stanislas Luhansk, and he acted well. He behaved well. He found the way to speak to his commanders. He acted as a commander-in-chief.
So he had a common language with his commanders?
I think so.
Okay.
I think so, yeah. He had this common language. And I remember when I was in his office on the presidential administration, and I did show him, not the film yet, which was not edited, but I did show him some photos. I had a lot of photos in the trench, and he knew every spot. He knew where it was. He did not make mistake about the ghost town, mm-hmm. which I was showing him, the trench, which I was, he knew. So Poroshenko built the army, and Zelensky deals well with this army for the moment.
Very good, very good. What's next? Okay.
The next is finished.
Next is finished. Let's have a great conversation.
Next is us.
Okay, let's do it. So, what inspired you? Well, the rest of us were stuck inside during COVID, learning how to knit, maybe building things, doing new COVID hobbies. You did something very unusual. You wrote a book. You made a brilliant movie. You went to 8 international hotspots. These are places that would not be high on my list to go to. You went to Nigeria, Syria and Iraqi Kurdistan, Ukraine, Somalia, Bangladesh, Lesbos, Greece, Libya, and Afghanistan. Why did you do this, and what inspired you?
Number one, I did that all my life. All my life, I tried my best. When I don't write philosophy or literature, I try my best to plead the cause of the most afflicted and the most lost and savagely attacked in the world. Number one. Number two, it had never been as urgent as at this moment, because this COVID crisis was also a moment where all of us, Americans, French, and so on, we had the temptation to enclose ourselves mm-hmm. in our selfishness, behind our borders, mm-hmm. and to get rid of the rest of the world. So I took it as a challenge. Of course, I was vaccinated as soon as it was possible. I wore the mask when it was requested, but I made it as a challenge to go more than ever to bear testimony of the 8 or 9 places, the most remote, the most out of access, the most impossible to reach, and the places where, for example, there was no vaccines, no way of escape the pandemic, no way to survive to this pandemic. So I made it as a point of honor and as a citizen challenge to try to do that. And I did that with the complicity of some outlets, Wall Street Journal in America, who published all these reportages, Paris Match in France, who endorsed me, Repubblica, the great daily in Italy, and many others.
Part of your message, though, I think, is don't be afraid. So it's also a response, don't be selfish, don't withdraw. The rest of the world matters. We can't afford to withdraw.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Don't be afraid. Don't say that. We have to be afraid. And today, we have to be afraid of what is preparing at the border of Ukraine. Afraid, yes. Fear is a good sentiment. To be afraid, to be anxious, and to react. But don't close the eyes. Don't get rid of the rest of the world, and so on. Yes, for sure. This is the world matters. And if we decide, if America tomorrow became a sort of mega island entrenched in its borders, it will be a world disaster for America. And it would be contrary, by the way, to the national interest of the US too.
Why?
Why? Because let's take the example of Ukraine. If tomorrow Putin decides, I pray that it does not happen, and I'm still not sure it will happen, and I still think that Biden and Macron can prevent it. But let's imagine that Putin invades Ukraine. Do you really think, first of all, it would be a shame?
Sure.
It would be a disaster for Ukraine, and we would have the responsibility of having dropped flat people, ladies and gentlemen, who are fighting for us and for our values. But it will have a huge domino effect. Europe as itself would be attacked. The Western world as itself would enter in an area of turmoil, unimaginable turmoil. The whole world would be disorganized by that. And America, behind its trenches, its fortress, will be isolated, will let the lead forever to Xi Jinping, to Vladimir Putin, to Erdogan, to all those, to those guys who are the enemies of America, who are the enemies of Europe, who are the enemies of the values on which our society are based.
Are you worried about a crisis in Ukraine developing into a World War III? Is that too far-fetched, or is that a real worry?
Melinda, I'm reading the statements of the Russians. There are moments, like in 1938, where you had to hear.
Yeah.
A few weeks ago, end of December, after December 17, when the Russians delivered an ultimatum to the NATO, you had a statement of the deputy foreign minister of Russia, who said that if the NATO did not accept as it is their ultimatum, there would be some retaliation, some military retaliation.
Yep.
You have the president of the Defense Commission of the Duma, who precised again the topic, who described what sort of threat Russia could implement against other countries than Ukraine, maybe the Baltic countries. You have the spokesman of the Kremlin a few days after the launching of a new missile, Zircon or something like that, who said, the spokesman of the Kremlin, who said that Russia was ready for preemptive strikes in the way Israel could do it against Iran. I'm sorry, but Russian officials who compare Europe to Iran and who compare themselves to Israel, first of all, there is something which does not match with reality. But forget that. It means that they are ready to enter in and to create a very dangerous world. They are threatening a war. They are conceiving this operation in Ukraine as a first step. This is what they say. And I don't even speak of what you can read in the semi-official outlets in Russia, where you have some crazy so-called experts who speak very bluntly on the possibility of a nuclear attack, very terrifying speculations about the consequence of a nuclear war in a very populated Europe on one side and a very big and sometimes desertic Russia on the other side. This is frightening. It is frightening. Mr. Putin has declared war to Europe. It's done. I'm not afraid. It is done. And if Europe is not able to support those who are on the front line, who are the Ukrainians, we will, Europeans, pay the price, and the Americans will pay the price after us.
So you're convinced that this Russian escalation is real, that this isn't just an attempt to squeeze a deal at the negotiating table?
I'm personally, intimately convinced that the leadership in Moscow probably don't know exactly what will happen next. They are not sure. They are not bad chess players, except that I don't want to insult chess play, which is a great play, but they're not bad. Okay, so they're observing what will be our reaction. But there is a plan, yes, which goes far beyond Ukraine. It's not today. I could quote you some declarations of important people in the Duma about Poland, about the Baltic countries few years ago, speculating on the time it would take for a Russian battalion to reach Estonia, and so on. The Russians are engaged in a bellicist rhetoric, number one. They have a geopolitical project, Eurasia, number two, and they have, number three, the means to achieve their goals. So, do we oppose to their means some equal means, or do we let them implement and develop their strategy? This is the question today, and it's a very serious question. And those who don't want to raise it, those who say, come on, it's just a way to make a deal and so on, they are in the situation of Chamberlain and Daladier, who in 1938 were exactly thinking the same, that Hitler was just playing games, that he was just trying to check our capacity of resistance, that he had limited goals. If you go to the literature, diplomatic literature of this year, 38, there is nearly an hallucination, how the speech, how the language looks like. 38, 2022. It's the same rhetoric with different situation. Putin is not Hitler, for sure. Nobody is like Hitler. That's a data. But this being said, our rhetoric is very similar.
You said something very interesting, though. You said it's not too late, that Putin can be stopped if Biden and Macron do the right things. What do we need to do?
The right thing will be to say exactly the opposite from what Biden said, but he can change his mind, that all the options are on the table, including the military option, if Ukraine was attacked. The real reply would be to have some Europeans and some Americans ready to defend Ukraine against the aggression militarily. And also, by the way, the second reply from us would be to provide to Ukrainian army enough means, enough tools in order to make very difficult a possible invasion. Because for the moment, I must say, I'm not an expert, but I spent time in these front line. I am one of those, there are others, who went all the way through from Mariupol to Luhansk.
Okay.
450 kilometers. I drove the whole distance. So I am an eyewitness. What I can say is two things. Number one, the soldiers, the citizen soldiers are brave.
Yes.
They are ready to fight. And they're ready to fight again for their family and their home and for us, for the values of Europe. But these trenches which I filmed, they are weak. They are very beginning of the 20th century, like you know Verdun, 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 these trenches in France, which were very elementary, very old-fashioned. It made me think the trenches of Ukraine to Verdun. They are not the most sophisticated, updated trenches. The arms which they have, and I saw again their tanks, I saw their weaponry in general. Again, not the most updated, not the most sophisticated. So we should think about that. Ukrainians deserve at least to have the means to react and to wage their patriotic resistance. And this is our responsibility.
Tell me about the mood in Europe. Is it even possible to get a coalition like you've discussed in Paris, in Berlin?
You know, President Macron just signed in the last hours a treaty of alliance with Greece, with Athens, just a few days ago, which is great. This is against, I suppose, Erdogan, Greece. And this is great, because Greece is the fatherland of Europe and of democracy. But Ukraine is not the fatherland, but it is the beating heart today of Europe. If there is a place in the continent where the heart of the values we are speaking here in Atlantic Council beats, it is in Ukraine. The values which are so often meaningless for the Europeans themselves, they take them for granted. The Ukrainians, maybe because they are not granted, maybe because they are under threat, maybe because they are facing the worst danger, which is liquidation of their nation, these values are vibrant in the hearts, in the minds of these people. So this is what we should understand. This is why I try to say the movie you mentioned at the beginning of our conversation, I made it why? In order to plead what I'm saying. It was shown in France, in Italy. It was a few days ago in New York, in the New York Jewish Film Festival. For me, it is so important to show the reality, to show to the Westerners that we have common values, common interest, and that the fight is common between Ukraine and us. I did the film for that. It is the same fight. If the Ukrainians lose, we will lose. If the Ukrainians resist, and if we give them the means to resist, because alone they will do it bravely, but they don't have. Their equipment is old. In front of the Buk missiles, earth, sky missiles of Russia, Buk, B-O-U-K, they have not the means to really, the tools to really resist that and confront the Buk missiles. So we have to in emergency, not next season, tomorrow, we have to deal with that.
What advice would you give to President Zelensky if you guys were sitting down and at that table where you've met him before, where you've met President Poroshenko, given the different problems that he has right now?
First of all, my first advice to President Zelensky, if I saw him, would be to give a break to former President Poroshenko. What is happening since a few hours in Kyiv is a shame. Is a shame.
Could you remind people what's happening right now?
What is happening is that former President Poroshenko is accused of betrayal of the interests, high betrayal of the interests of the country. He was in Poland, he came back, he is facing a heavy prosecution, and the media say that he could go to jail. This, I don't have all the informations, but I know Poroshenko. I met him a few days ago in Paris. I know that this man, who is the father of the new army, who is one of the builders of the new Ukraine, it's a joke to consider him as a betrayal of the fatherland. It's a joke. But it is not only a joke, it is perceived by a lot of Ukrainians, and it is perceived by the allies of Ukraine as a political trial, as a political maneuver. And what I would say to Vladimir Zelensky is that when you are facing Putin, when you are facing a life and death situation as he is facing, national unity is required. And witch hunt against Poroshenko in this case is the worst option. So first advice, give a break to Poroshenko, make national unity, forget the political revenge, because this trial, this accusation to Poroshenko, maybe I'm wrong, but it really smells as a political will to get rid of a strong opponent. It is not the moment. First of all, there are other ways to get rid of an opponent. You have to be stronger than him. You have to be better. You have to be more eloquent, whatever. And number two, it is not the moment.
And you can contest each other in elections.
And they will. I think that they will contest in election, yes, and that's the best way for this new democracy, which is Ukraine, and which is already a great democracy. The best way to empty the quarrel, in we say in French, vider une querelle, empty a quarrel, is to go to the voters and to ask who do you want. Not this farce, not this comedy. And yesterday in Ukraine, you had the image of people greeting Poroshenko when he arrived at the airport of Kyiv. You had these images of a strong clash between two Ukraine. Who is happy with that at this moment? Who was observing Kyiv with happiness and a big smile? Putin.
Of course.
That was the best for Putin.
Of course.
So no gift to Putin. National unity. Stop the witch hunt. This would be my message if I was in front of Zelensky, as I was a few times.
Fantastic, fantastic. Thank you so much. Could you say just a little bit more about your film? You went to 8 different places. What other common threads did you discover during your travels to these hotspots?
The common point is that they are forgotten places, forgotten wars, that like the philosopher Martin Heidegger said, the characters of this movie have a common characteristic. They are deprived of their life, of course, deprived of their health, but they are deprived even of their own death. And to be deprived of your own death, to be dead in mass, to be dead sometimes without a proper grave, to be dead without a proper funeral, that, Martin Heidegger said, is the worst which can happen to an alive person. And this is the common point which I found, in spite of all the differences, in Nigeria, in Libya, in Syrian Kurdistan, with these valiant ladies living their feminism with weapons in hands against ISIS and against Erdogan, and so on. So this is the common point.
Did you learn anything about yourself as a result of this trip and of going to these hotspots?
I always learned. All my life I did some war reportage since I am a young teenager. So I know that. And what I always learn on myself, but it is a continuous lesson, is that you have a conflict in yourself, in some situation, when I am in a trench in Donetsk, for example, when I spend a night with the threat of snipers in front of me, of the soldiers who host me, therefore, as a collateral effect on myself. What do I think? What do I learn from myself? Is that, of course, you can be afraid, but there is something which is worse than fear, which is shame. Shame not to do your job. Shame to be the representative of a country, Europe, of a place, Europe, who does not do the job, who does not have eyes wide open on a situation in which its destiny, the destiny of Europe, is at stake. So in these situations, a night of bombing shared between natural anxiety, of course, for me, for my family, and much more for the patriotic soldiers close to me, because I will go away in a few hours or days, sure. They will remain, and shame. Sometimes I was ashamed of being representing a Europe which is so unfaithful and undeserving of its own credit. We don't do what we should have to do. And in Ukraine, again, Putin says, what I ask to NATO, what I ask to Biden, is to be clear that Ukraine will never be in NATO. But come on, the peoples are not pieces on a chessboard. People have a right to autodetermination. It's not us Westerners, but it's not them Eurasians who can decide in the place of the Belarus people, of the Ukrainian peoples, what they want for their destiny. We are not playing. This way of thinking of peoples as pieces on a board is disgusting. This is the way in which Putin, Erdogan, Xi Jinping, the Ayatollah in Iran, the chiefs of the Islamist International think. They think this way. Countries like pieces you can displace. It is absolutely a shame. And we have to oppose that with all our strength and our spirit.
Bernard, critics will say, though, that if we follow the advice that you laid out, we are backing a failed state. A lot of people will call Ukraine a failed state. They'll say that the Ukrainian army is not as strong as its boosters would claim, and that if we followed your advice, that would pull America and the Western world into a military confrontation with Russia. What's your response?
I don't think so. I think that the biggest possibility is that it will bring us at the worst in a Cold War, which is not exactly a military confrontation. Cold War was not so bad in a sense. Cold War meant that we put on the ground the means to avoid a hot war. Cold War had some virtues. Cold War means deterrence. Cold War means that we say to a possible enemy, don't touch, don't move, stay where you are. And generally, when you are America and when you are Europe, it works. America, at least till the last years, when America acted strongly, America was respected. And maybe America is less respected since a few recent episodes. This should be restored. This respect in America, this credit given to the word of America, this should be restored in emergency. And Ukraine could be an opportunity for America to regain its credibility. If not, we will enter in a world of disarray, of disorder, of violence, and of chaos. This is the most predictable, alas, option. If we let Putin do, if we let him implement his Eurasian dream, which means number one, to change the borders in Europe, and number two, to impose a model of society which is the opposite, which is contrary to the democratic one, we will lose much more, and we will take much more risk than putting a stop to his ambitions.
Am I understanding you correctly that you think that President Biden has not deterred Putin? President Biden said, if you invade Ukraine again, I'm going to throw the meanest, nastiest package of sanctions at you. I'm going to send more defensive material to Ukraine, and there'll be more NATO troops in Eastern Europe.
Putin, are you sure that Putin cares so much about sanctions? He has already all sorts of sanctions. Personal, his relatives, the country. He does not care. He has this alliance with China. He has these proxy allies who hate Russia but who are momentarily allied with him, like Turkey. So he does not care sanctions. The only language he would be able to listen to would be that a military adventure in Ukraine would have a high cost for him and for his country, in domestically speaking.
Fantastic. If you're just joining us, we are so lucky to have Bernard-Henri Lévy from Paris here. He is a remarkable philosopher, filmmaker, and author. He is the new author of The Will to See, and it's also a film. If you'd like to submit a question, I'd love to read it to him. You can submit it on Zoom or on Twitter. So I have a number of questions from our audience. First of all, Rebecca Harm says hello, and thank you for your discussion of Poroshenko and Zelensky. I have a question about French politics. Julian says candidates for presidential elections in France have a tremendous statement on the situation in Ukraine. From far left to far right, including far green, I can't see any understanding of the situation. How to explain to the French people the situation there with a historical comparison?
You are right, Madame. Question of Putin and of Russia is a dividing line in French politics. And it is a real stake in the next election. First of all, because Kremlin has probably the intention, as they did in America, to put their hands in our political democratic process. But number two, because we have a huge party in France, which is a party of devotees of Putin, of people who are pro-Putin. And this party is an unformulated party which recruits its partisans on the right and on the left. You have, to be clear, candidates like Mrs. Le Pen or Mr. Zemmour, or you have candidates, the leftist one, like Jean-Luc Mélenchon, who are really pro-Putin, who buy all the narrative of Putin. There is, yesterday, and if Estonia was invaded, he said, I could not care less, and so on. So you have in France, from the right and from the left, an informal party of those who buy, or who are bought by, I don't know, the narrative of Putin.
Thank you so much. Michael Vanderpool wants to know, he says, thank you for your great and epic work. If the Ukraine-Russia war escalates into Russian military action further, either into Ukraine or occupying Ukraine in full, what should the U.S., French and Western response be, and what specific steps should be taken? Is there a good chance of de-escalation of the current war in Ukraine?
I think the only way for the escalation not to happen is to prevent it. I don't want to ask myself how we should react if Putin invades. The real question is, how to prevent Putin from invading. If he invades, it will be too late, because there would be, I can tell you, so many, the blood will be spilled if he invades. The Ukrainians will not surrender without fighting. And this is I know wars. I saw so many in my life. It is the most horrible thing. It is the worst tragedy which can happen. We had to do all we can, all our best to prevent this catastrophe of war. Not to know how to act if there is war, how to act in order of to war not happen. This is a real question. So endorse Ukraine, support Zelensky, support the armed force in Ukraine, deploy an international force on the ground, deliver defensive weapons in order to deter Putin. These are the things which are on the table.
Wonderful. I have a question from Jack, and this is an interesting one. He said, what question would you ask Putin to get him to think about what he's really trying to do with Ukraine that might make a difference?
Say it again.
Is there any way that you could appeal to Putin? If you were having a conversation with him, what question would you ask him to get him to think about what he's doing?
In my film, there is a segment where Zelensky, we are together, and Zelensky speaks of Putin. Vladimir speaks about Vladimir. And he has this very sharp comment. He says, what strikes me in Putin is that he has no eyes. This is a scene of the film, no eyes. And he looks at me, Zelensky, and he tells me, when you look at somebody, you see something in the eyes. Brain, emotion, intelligence, fear, whatever. When you look at Putin, you see nothing, no eyes. This is one of the clever things which Zelensky said. I'm sorry that he said it to me, but it's a fact. So I trust him. I think that if I was in front of Putin, I would be in front of this very strange FSB guy thinking such in a different way as you, me, and James. So I don't know what I would tell him. And I never tried to meet him, to be honest, because of that. I would not know how to deal with a man who apparently has no eyes.
Oh my God. Julian wants to know, why didn't this happen in 2014, 2015? Why didn't Putin go big then?
Because in 2014, 2015, it was before Afghanistan. It was before Belarus. It was before the retreat from Syrian Kurdistan, when Trump decided to take out the forces. It was before the retreat from Iraqi Kurdistan, referendum of 2017, where again Trump decided to wash his hands with the blood of the Kurds. So it was another time. In 2014 and 15, America had its whole credibility. Putin was afraid of America. America was not considered by the generals of Putin as a paper tiger, a tiger of paper. This is a new situation. The world moved so quickly in 7 years. And the biggest move, the most, the one who frightens me more is this loss of credibility of your country.
Good point. Very good point. Okay, Mihailo says, good evening from Kyiv, and he's an officer of the Ukrainian army, a veteran of the Russian-Ukrainian war. And he says, Mr. Lévy, tell me why Europeans do not perceive us Ukrainians as European.
Maybe because my reply is that the Europeans maybe don't care so much today about Europe itself. Maybe they lost faith in proper Europe. Maybe you, sir, who asked this question, are more European than we are in Europe. Maybe the flag of Europe is waving more proudly on the Maidan and in the hearts of the brave soldiers of Zolote, of Pisky, of Luhansk, and of Donetsk than in the heart of the so-called Europeans. This is the point.
Thank you so much. Another question, merci beaucoup for the fantastic presentation. I think this is someone from Central Asia, and she says, could you give your advice to other CIS countries about how to deal with Russia right now? Thank you.
It's very difficult to give an advice to people who are facing a dictator and who are taking the risk of death in front of him. So I can give advice to my people because I myself take the appropriate risks when I go on front line with my Ukrainian brothers. But to give an advice to Navalny, to give an advice to a Kazakh Democrat, to give an advice to the brave women of Belarus, I would not do that because they are fighting for their life, for their death, against their death, for their family. So it's too hot and too delicate. I can only leave it to them.
One of our questioners wants to know, given everything that's happening right now and Putin's insistence on NATO, should Europe greenlight EU membership for Ukraine right now?
Of course, of course. The only reply, low in geopolitics, low, you don't accept blackmail. You don't accept blackmail. You don't accept fait accompli, accomplished deeds. Because if you accept this, you will have that. When you accept Crimea, after Crimea, you have to accept Kazakhstan, or Belarus, after Belarus, Kazakhstan, after Kazakhstan, Ukraine, after Ukraine, Estonia, after Estonia, Poland, and so on. If you accept to enter in this mechanism of cowardice, of compromise, and of compromising on the values, political compromise it's fine. Moral and ethical compromise is precisely what we don't have to accept.
Two more questions for you. Philip wants to know, what are you thinking about Belarus? Are you worried about Belarus being pulled into the current conflict?
Belarus, one of the great encounters of my life is Svetlana Tikhanovskaya. I met her in Vilnius the day after she crossed the border and entered in Lithuania. Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, the embodiment and the leader of the Democrats in Lithuania, in Belarus. I was so impressed by this lady. I was so impressed by her moral compass. I was so impressed by her ethical force. I was so impressed by the risks she was taking with her husband in jail and so on. And in general, beyond her, we spent a long time together. And I published my encounter. I think it is online, maybe in the Atlantic or in Tablet magazine. I don't know, it can be found easily. I was so impressed by, in general, the bravery of the women of Belarus. If you have today heroes of democracy, heroes of the ethical values which makes a society easy to live, these heroes are often women, and they are in Ukraine, Marta, and they are in Belarus, Tikhanovskaya.
Wonderful. I so enjoyed this conversation. Thank you for coming to Washington to be with us. If you haven't read this book yet, you must go to Amazon. It is called The Will to See. Our listeners would also like to know how can they watch your film?
I think the film will be I hope so. I don't know, but I hope it will be released in America. It will be released in many parts of Europe. I would love it to be released, by the way. I address, I don't know whom, in Ukraine. It is a film which might warm the heart of some of my friends, which I let back in the front line, and I would love them to see the film which I did with them, for them. They are the author of this film. Ukraine for me is capital, and of course America. But I think there will be a commercial release in America rather soon, I hope.
Great.
Cross fingers.
Let's make it happen. Let's take the film to Ukraine and watch his Twitter, and we'll put more information about where you can see that film. Thank you. You are our North Star. We love your work. Thank you for all that you're doing. Thank you for being here with us today. Thank you for joining us. It was our great pleasure to host Bernard-Henri Lévy. Until next time, thank you very much. Goodbye.